Hey everyone, this is Michael from the Radically Normal podcast team. I'm one of the co-hosts along with Andre, and today, on today's video, I'm going to be talking about the top 10 books that I read this year. I reference a lot of different books on the podcast, but today I want to narrow it down to 10. The 10 best books that I read this year, not necessarily that were published this year, although some of them were. And so today I'm going to begin with a recent release, Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And so in this book, I'll just read you his introduction, his introductory point, which is that at the heart of this book lies a basic conviction. The so-called sexual revolution of the last 60 years, culminating in its latest triumph, the normalization of transgenderism, cannot be properly understood until it is set within the context of a much broader transformation in how society understands the nature of human selfhood. And so this goes along with his subtitle, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. So he focuses on how morality has turned to the internal, how it's no longer based on external categories or transcendent ideas, but based on what we inwardly feel. And so he looks at Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin, and how those three men led a revolution in which personhood and identity could be explained apart from theism. And then he spends a lot of time looking at Sigmund Freud and how at the very core of his message was that at the core of human beings, we are sexual beings and sexual desire drives our lives. And so that led into today's culture in which we are seeking identity and freedom apart from all restraints. And so that goes hand in hand with the entire title of the book and how we have turned from external transcendent categories about sexuality and landed with the sexual revolution of today. So he looks at not how the last 50 years have evolved to today, but how this long evolving idea of identity has led to where we are today. The second book here is one that I've recommended to more friends than any book on this list, Delighting in the Trinity by Michael Reeves. And so just to read one quote, he says, the Father sent his Son to make himself known, meaning not that he wanted simply to download some information about himself, but that the love the Father eternally had for the Son might be in those who believe in him, and that we might enjoy the Son as the Father always has. And so in this book, he just teaches you to truly delight in who God's triune nature is, and how without God's triunity, we are left with nothing, and how we can delight in Jesus more because we know that the triune God himself. And so this is an incredible book, one that I highly, highly recommend. This book right here is John Mark Comer's The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And so just to read one quote from Comer, our value system is turned on its head. Hurry is of the devil, slow is of Jesus, because Jesus is what love looks like in flesh and blood. And so actually the guy who's recording this was borrowing this book because I thought it was so good. And he's taught me how to incorporate a Sabbath, how to live with simplicity and a gear towards minimalism almost. And this has been an incredible book about slowing down and having a slow-paced life that can align with a healthy spiritual life. This next book is by Dane Ortland and has gotten a lot of attention this year. It's called Gentle and Lowly, The Heart of Christ for Sinners and Sufferers. And this book is so good that you could turn to any given page and just find a quote that's good, but he talks about the heart of Christ towards those who are sinners. Even when we feel like Christ might reject us in his holiness and righteousness, Christ draws near to those who appear and are ugly, that Christ draws near to sinners, and that Jesus loves us, and that God moves near to us in the person and work of Jesus. And so I highly recommend that. He talks a lot about Jesus' actual heart, focusing on that verse from Matthew 11, on Jesus saying how his heart is gentle and lowly. This is the only fiction book on this list, and this is one I've read for over the course slowly of a few months, called East of Eden. The plot line or the summary will tell you on the inside flap that it's a modern retelling of Genesis, and there's certainly a lot of connections to Cain and Abel, even to Adam and Eve. But even apart from that, it is an incredible story dealing with generations of two families whose lives end up intersecting. And so there's a lot of connections, certainly to the Bible, and the title comes from how Cain went and settled out to the east of Eden in Genesis 4. But this is an incredible book, and really shaped and moved my imagination throughout the story, all 600 pages. And so I couldn't recommend that one more. This is the shortest book on the list, maybe just over 100 pages by scholar Richard Bauckham, and this one got a lot of attention too when it came out this year. And so Bauckham talks about who is God, and he looks at in four chapters he dissects this, looking at Jacob's dream at Bethel, looking at Moses and the burning bush, I am who I am, in Exodus 3, and then later in Exodus, after the golden calf incident, Moses seeing God's glory on the mountain. And so those were an incredible three stories in the Old Testament in which he dissects and looks at those, and then he looks at the Gospel of Mark, three incidents there, and how we can see who God is through these moments of biblical revelation. And so the key point in this book to me was just seeing how at where Jacob has that dream at Bethel, now everywhere he goes will be a Bethel. God's presence will be with him wherever he goes. This book, The Courage to Stand, I won't spend much time on because we interviewed Dr. Russell Moore, and you can view that on our YouTube or on the podcast app, Radically Normal. But the central theme of this book is that the call to courage in the Bible is the call to be crucified. And so this is a great exposition of biblical courage, looking at the life of Elijah. And we had a great time with that interview. This is a bit of an anomaly on this list, and so is the next one, but this is a book called American Moonshot, John F. Kennedy and the Great Space Race. I love political history, and I also love things dealing with space and always have, and so that was a good middle ground of political history and space, and I really enjoyed this book. It was long, and I happened to read it over quarantine. I was glad I picked it up at Barnes & Noble, and I really just enjoyed it, and it's a lot to get into, the German scientist that ended up helping America get to space first and all of that and how that unfolded. But the author does a great job, Douglas Brinkley, of setting the course of time as we see JFK's life intertwine with the space race. But I did find it interesting that on page 286, it's seen that JFK actually would have preferred to maybe just sit down with a book or a newspaper, but he began and learned to enjoy the television, how he used TV to shape his presidency before his assassination. The second to last book is also an anomaly on this list, kind of, but it's called The World Beneath Their Feet, Mountaineering, Madness, and the Deadly Race to Summit the Himalayas. I was reading this book while I was on a trip to California with the OU baseball team before COVID hit and we got sent home, but I finished this in just a few days. It was an amazing story of the history of going to the Himalayas, different countries, and the geopolitical realm surrounding that in the early to mid-20th century. Obviously, one of the high points was Sir Edmund Hillary being the first to summit Mount Everest. Okay, and then so just wrapping up for the last and the 10th book, we were just talking about Mount Everest, and now we're talking about perhaps the Mount Everest of books here. Fred Bruner's commentary on the Gospel of John was incredible. I used it for the entire summer going through the Gospel. He blends historical interpretations from Augustine to Calvin to Luther, and then with his own interpretation, so you get historical and modern, and it's not super dense where it's overwhelming. It's also very devotional and applicable, and it's a super good aid to going through the Gospel of John. I would recommend it to anyone, and so thanks for joining us today for the top 10 books of 2020.